안녕하십니까. And thank you to Chairman Bach, Professor Pak Chung-chul, and National Assemblyman Kim and and other honored guests. What I'll speak today about is COVID-19 pandemic and international response, the race for a vaccine, which has certainly been a topic that has been at the front of many of our minds since the pandemic started in January of 2020. So this number is already out of date. As you heard, there are over 1 million deaths due to COVID-19. And as we look at the data, we understand that in many places the number of deaths is actually underreported, so that this number is tragically even higher. You can see where the infections and cumulative cases are highest. Of course, the United States, India, and Brazil. Korea has done, as you've heard, very well. And I was on an international conference call last night looking at the responses around the world, and I think the overwhelming response from people and scientists and clinicians around the world is one of congratulations to the Republic of Korea for the amazing job that it did in controlling COVID-19 until we have other preventive measures, such as a vaccine. As we approach the question of vaccine development, so these are questions we were asking in January. Many of them we don't actually have the answer to today, but I think we're making some progress. The first question is, does natural COVID-19 infection prevent reinfection? And this is actually a very important hypothetical question, because for those diseases, for those infectious pathogens for which we have vaccines, in general, when you get the infection prevents reinfection. This just means that it might theoretically be possible to develop a vaccine more readily. And that is actually a critical point. So far, we think that that's been true around the world. In animal studies, actually, in fact, in monkey studies, 3 monkey studies have shown that if you infect the monkey with COVID-19 and you allow it to recover, that those monkeys are subsequently immune to reinfection. That actually raises hope that a vaccine could be in this first batch of vaccines that is now in phase 3, or the final phase of testing. A second very important question, and actually a subsequent speaker will address this in much greater detail, has to do with the need for seasonal COVID-19 vaccines. So will a vaccine that we develop today be adequate in 2022 or 2023, or will the virus mutate or be replaced by a different strain? What we know to date about the amount of sequence variation in COVID-19 is it's actually fairly small. That compared to the seasonal flu, there is 10 times less variation in COVID-19. This raises the possibility and the hope that the current set of COVID-19 vaccines will continue to work in the future. There are no guarantees, however. The next question is, what of those protective immune responses is the most important? And this matters because we can now design vaccines to emphasize certain features of the response. We can have vaccines that generate lots of infection-fighting proteins called antibodies. In particular, the kinds of antibodies that bind to and inactivate the virus, known as neutralizing antibodies. But we can also put in additional features of the vaccine that will allow the parts of what we call the cellular immune system, killer cells, to be activated. And it may actually be that it's a balance between infection-fighting proteins, antibodies, and T cells, or killer cells. The next question is around animal models. And I think people who are familiar with scientists and lab rats and testing things in monkeys and rabbits, and actually it turns out that this is really critical if we want to accelerate vaccine development. Why is that? If we can infect an animal species with the virus, say COVID-19, and that animal gets sick or dies, and we can prevent that with a vaccine, then there is an increased chance, an increased likelihood that vaccine development in humans will be successful. The tragic story of HIV is one that I'm very familiar with because I come out of the HIV vaccine research world. We have not been able to develop an animal model for HIV. We have to use a cousin of the HIV virus called SIV. And so far, every animal model in HIV has pointed us in the wrong direction. With COVID-19, we can infect genetically modified mice, we can infect hamsters, we can infect monkeys and ferrets with COVID-19, And vaccines will prevent infection in those animal species. So again, hopeful that the vaccines that are currently in phase 3 testing will also protect humans against COVID-19 infection and disease. And the final point is safety. We always worry about safety. And this is actually one of the concerns actually that's been raised recently, because several countries have approved vaccines for use in the absence of any evidence of safety or efficacy. I think many of us are familiar with some of the horror stories that have happened with vaccines in the past. So companies and governments are very reluctant to license vaccines before actual proof of safety and protection against infection. Are there potential safety concerns? Yes. In particular, around a cousin of SARS-CoV-2. The original SARS virus, which I think many people remember, hit the world around 2002. That virus, when we tried to develop vaccines against it, was associated with things in animal models that might potentially be a problem. It looked like, in some cases, that the presence of infection-fighting proteins might make the infection worse. It was also clear that you could protect mice, certain strains or species of mice, against infection, but they would then develop a second kind of allergic disease in the lungs. If that happened in human populations with a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, we would be very reluctant to approve the vaccine for use. Therefore, safety always has to be at the top of our mind when we're developing vaccines. Vaccines are developed for healthy people to keep them healthy. In this way, they're different from medicine, which is given to people who are sick in order to make them better. So under normal circumstances, it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. The drug companies tell us that it takes $500 million to $1.5 billion and is associated with a failure rate from lab to licensure of 93%. That means that only 1 in 10 vaccines make it from the laboratory, through animal testing, through human testing, to here, where the product is actually approved by a regulatory agency like the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety and sold. The phases of human clinical trials are very strict. We go through phase 1, which is around safety, phase 2, which is around immunogenicity. Is the vaccine making the right protective responses in the target population? And then finally, in phase 3, around efficacy and safety. Does the vaccine actually prevent infection or disease? And is the vaccine safe? These are really critical questions. And given the failure rate and the cost, companies are very careful about what they take forward. What we're doing now is we're asking them to take this 5 to 10 year cycle and compress it into 6 to 18 months. And how would you do that? This is an artificial, hypothetical development cycle that takes 5 years. This is the stage of testing in animals. We then enter the phase of testing in humans, which again is really around safety. Safety in maybe 50 volunteers or so. If the vaccine is safe, then you move on into phase 2, which begins to test the vaccine in the target population and to look for the right protective responses. If we're convinced of that, then by the middle of year 3, we've moved on into phase 3, which sometimes lasts a year or 2 years and involves thousands, if not tens of thousands of individuals. So you can see how that might drive the cost of vaccine development. From that, we get information on safety and efficacy. Does the vaccine protect against infection and disease? And if it's the case, and if you can convince the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety or the Food and Drug Administration of the United States of efficacy and safety, then you can register the vaccine and begin to sell it. Now that is a 5-year development cycle. What does it look like if we compress it into 1 year? So in this case, and this applies primarily to vaccines for which the vaccine platform has already been shown to be safe, you can actually do some of the animal testing studies coincident with the first phase of testing in humans. DNA vaccines would be a classic example. RNA vaccines were the same. The US FDA and the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety allowed vaccines to move forward before the completion of animal studies. Now with phase 1, and typically the COVID vaccines are given in 2 doses, so after the last volunteer in phase 1 receives the second dose of vaccine, you'll have information about safety at a week or 2 weeks after vaccination. If you're satisfied with that, the regulatory agencies have allowed you then to progress into phase 2. Now, phase 1 will still continue for the duration of a year, But phase 1 is initiated usually 2 to 3 months after the start of phase 2. Once you start to collect information in phase 2 on safety, and after the second dose is given on the correct protective responses, if you're satisfied, then companies have moved on into phase 3 before phase 2 is completed. That allows them to start enrolling the tens of thousands of individuals it will need in order to show that the vaccine is safe and protects against infection or disease. They are allowed to peak, and we call these an interim analysis. And the interim analyses are probably going to be done in the next month to 2 months for the vaccines that are currently in phase 3 testing. This includes vaccines from Europe, North America, and China. And if there's evidence of safety and protection against infection, then the company may apply for emergency use approval or actually try to register the vaccine. Now, pretty unlikely that the national regulatory authorities will allow licensure on the basis of 2 months of follow-up data. In fact, there's a bit of a controversy now in the United States, as the Food and Drug Administration is saying, we will not even issue emergency use approval until all the volunteers have been followed for at least 2 months for safety reasons. And the reason is the majority of the bad side effects occur within the first 2 months of vaccination. If the Food and Drug Administration or the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety is satisfied, then you can receive emergency use approval and begin extended safety follow-up. Now, remember that all these trials are still continuing. And I think that the bottom line here is that we will use the standard criteria for efficacy, for proof that the vaccine protects against infection or disease. The problem is around safety. Usually we would have a fairly long period of long-term follow-up of volunteers who've received vaccines and trials in a 5 or 10-year development cycle. We don't have that information available if we do the vaccines in a year. So companies and countries need to commit to the follow-up of volunteers who've participated in phase 3 trials to ensure longer-term safety information is available for the vaccines. So with all that risk, with all of the costs associated with vaccine development, how could you persuade a big company to put $1.5 billion on the line in order to develop a vaccine in 12 months? So the United States and other countries, including the organization known as CEPI, had an answer. Well, the issue is around cost. And so what the US did is something that they call Operation Warp Speed. These are the companies. This is the amount of money the US government has given them. In total, $10.3 billion has been used to help de-risk the cost of rapid development of these vaccines. So if you want to accelerate development, you de-risk. And how do you de-risk? By providing funding. So here's the funding. The companies have, in addition, committed to manufacturing doses of vaccine in anticipation of efficacy, so that by next year, there may be hundreds of millions of doses available to vaccinate people in the United States. CEPI has also put in $1.4 billion of advanced funding. The beauty of CEPI funding, and Korea is a member of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, is that CEPI funding comes with a global access agreement. That means that the vaccine will be available around the world. And also, the companies that received CEPI funding agreed to provide the vaccine at a reasonable cost. Again, hopefully, that reasonable cost will be in the reach of countries in the developing world as well. Now, I'm not going to go through this because it's, with over 200 candidates now and 43 currently in clinical testing, it's actually difficult to talk about each and every vaccine. This is a table that shows the types of vaccines available against COVID-19 that are actively being developed in preclinical and clinical platforms. These are the human clinical trials. Actually, this is wrong. Since last week, another one has been added, so now there are 44. But you can see there are a large number of human clinical trials going on within 9 months of actually discovering the virus. That's really remarkable. I didn't have time, but I would have shown a slide to show how long it takes typically from the identification of the pathogen to the development of the vaccine, and this has really been done in record time. This gives you a better idea of the front runners. And what you see here on the left are the different companies. The first circle is when the first human volunteer received a vaccine. The second circle, when the first data from human volunteers was available. The third circle, when the phase 3 or phase 2/3 study started. And the hatched area, when the first supply of vaccine should become available. so that you can see that there should be vaccine available for some of the vaccines as early as October of this year. And then other companies are planning to roll out vaccine in the beginning of next year. So there are plans for the manufacture of vaccines in anticipation of efficacy. The little stars are now those companies, you can see they're in China and Russia, that have emergency use approval for their vaccines. Not all countries have done this. Most national regulatory authorities require that a vaccine be safe and efficacious before granting emergency use approval. So there are 3 stages to vaccine development. Prove it, prove the vaccine works, make the vaccine, and use it. Making enough vaccine to vaccinate the 8 billion people in this world is going to be tough. CEPI has identified roughly 10 billion doses of vaccine manufacturing capacity. That's great, but not all of that vaccine manufacturing capacity can make the vaccines that are currently in clinical testing. An organization known as Kovacs, which is actually a group of 3, led by 3 groups, CEPI, the WHO, and Gavi, hopes to have 2 billion doses available by the end of 2021. This would be roughly 20% of the doses necessary around the world. Operation Warp Speed, the US program, is manufacturing hundreds of millions of doses in anticipation of success. And I think probably the most important thing for Korea and other countries around the world is that the companies that are in the lead, whether they be AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson, are beginning to make contracts with companies around the world that can do low-cost, high-quality vaccine manufacture. And that would include Serum Institute of India, SK Bioscience in Korea, Butantan, which is in Brazil, companies like Lonza, which are contract manufacturers in Europe. But I think, people are saying, who's going to win this race? It isn't the country. It isn't the company. This is a race that the global population, that humanity must win. And really, does the prize go to the first company to prove efficacy? Or should it really go to the group that first provides hundreds of millions of doses of a safe and effective vaccine for global populations? This slide addresses Kovacs. Kovacs is a facility provided by CEPI, World Health Organization, and Gavi, with several important components. Kovacs first ensures global access by providing roughly 20% of global need. This is sufficient to vaccinate high-risk populations, that is, the elderly and healthcare workers, around the world. It's also impact-oriented and transparent. Being international in scope, it is trying to develop norms and standards that can be applied as vaccine is distributed to countries that need it around the world. And finally, it wants to develop a sense of solidarity and collective ownership to oppose the vaccine nationalism and vaccine geopolitics that have taken over some of the discussions around the development and deployment of COVID-19 vaccines. Korea has signed an expression of interest to join Kovacs, joining over now 170 countries, actually 174 countries, that have signaled their intent to join this. And again, 2 billion doses of WHO pre-qualified vaccine should be available by the end of 2021. Now, against Kovacs, we have the reality. And this is from a Wall Street Journal. This Sankey diagram shows the companies on the left-hand side and the countries that have pre-purchased doses. So you can see the United States has pre-purchased a total of 1.6 billion doses. The European Union, 1.5 billion, the UK, 400 million, Japan, 300 million doses of vaccine, even though they don't know that the vaccine works, in order to ensure that their populations have vaccine when and if the vaccine is available. And what we want to avoid is the problem with rotavirus vaccine. 13 years after rotavirus vaccine was approved by the US FDA, and 11 years after the World Health Organization recommended its use, 60% of the world's children still do not receive 3 doses of rotavirus vaccine. And this gap, if it exists in COVID-19, will greatly complicate the world's desire to end this epidemic quickly and efficiently. So finally, we will probably have evidence of safety and protection against infection and disease by later this year or early next year. But really, what is the day after efficacy? Will it look like the day after someone makes this great announcement? The big questions: who will make it? Will we ensure access and equity in this allocation of vaccine? Is this vaccine the vaccine that we will want to use 5 years from now? Probably not. There'll probably be variations of dose and schedule, maybe a completely different vaccine. We don't know the answer to that question. We need to determine something called correlates of protection, very important in the rapid development of improvements on the vaccine. So we don't have to spend $10.3 billion anymore. We'll be able to do it in a much shorter time for much less money. We really need to develop evidence in the real world. So it's one thing to test a vaccine in a clinical trial of 40,000 people. It's another to give it to 8 billion people. Will we, very importantly, see herd protection? Because that greatly will change government's policies around the use of the vaccine, around our ability to get out and do things that we had done prior to COVID-19. So then the question around licensure emergency use, and of course real questions around safety, are things that we'll leave to the day after efficacy. But we know that it will not be quick and simple to get back to the old normal. And hopefully a vaccine will contribute to the solution. Thank you.